Sir, this boy lived with me at the orphanage. Elena's voice shattered the silence of that Thursday afternoon. She clutched the cleaning cloth with trembling hands, her eyes wide and fixed on the framed photograph above the fireplace in the study. Marcus set down his glass of whiskey. He turned so fast he nearly knocked over the chair. What did the new maid just say? The quiet girl who had barely spoken a word to him in the 3 weeks since she started working here was now pale as a ghost. This boy right here. He lived at St. Michael's orphanage with me. We shared the same dormitory. His name was Daniel. A chill ran down Marcus's spine. Daniel, a name he hadn't heard in 32 years. The name of his twin brother who had vanished when they were only 4 years old. That's impossible. My brother. He died a long time ago. Elena shook her head, tears beginning to stream down her face. I don't know anything about any death, sir, but I know for certain that boy lived at the orphanage until he was 16. He was my best friend. He protected me whenever the older kids tried to bully me. Marcus crossed the room in 3 strides. He snatched the photograph from her hands. The boy in the picture was smiling, the same dark eyes he saw in the mirror every morning, the same facial structure, the same crooked smile that tilted slightly to the left. Are you sure? Absolutely sure, sir. I could never forget that face. Daniel always talked about a twin brother, about a big house, about a father who did dangerous work and always wore black suits. Marcus's throat tightened. His father had been Don Giovanni Blackwood, the most feared mob boss in Chicago. He always wore black suits. That was the legacy Marcus had inherited. He talked about his brother all the time. Elena continued, wiping her face with the back of her hand. He said one day you two would find each other again. He said his brother would never stop looking for him. Soft footsteps on the staircase interrupted their conversation. Ethan appeared at the study door, clutching the teddy bear he hadn't let go of since the accident. The 7-year-old boy's face was pale, his eyes frightened. Daddy, did something happen? Nothing, son. Go back to your room. But Ethan looked at Elena, and something in the maid's eyes seemed to calm the child. Elena managed a gentle smile despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. Hey, Ethan. Everything's fine, sweetie. Just boring grown-up talk. Ethan stood still for a few more seconds, looking from the maid to his father. Then he nodded slowly and climbed the stairs. But before disappearing down the hallway, he turned back once more, as if making sure Elena was still there. When the boy was gone, Marcus sank into the leather armchair. His legs could no longer bear the weight of this revelation. He had killed men without flinching. He had built an empire on blood and fear, but right now, his hands were shaking. Tell me everything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything you know about him. What do you think will happen next? Will Marcus find his long-lost twin brother after 32 years? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. If you're hooked on this story, smash that like button and share it with someone who loves a good drama. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter, trust me. You don't want to miss what's coming. Elena took a long, steady breath, then began to speak. She talked about the details she had never been able to forget through the 20 years of separation. Daniel had a crescent-shaped birthmark right behind his left ear, a pale brown mark he often tried to hide with his hair because he felt embarrassed. Marcus flinched, his hand tightening around the arm of the chair. That birthmark, he remembered it perfectly, because he had an identical one in the very same place. His mother had once told him it was the sign of twin children, the way heaven and earth marked that they belonged to each other. Elena went on, saying Daniel was left-handed, yet he could write and draw skillfully with both hands. Daniel said their father had taught him that when he was very young, to train his flexibility. Marcus felt his throat clamp shut. His father really had taught both brothers to write with 2 hands. He used to say that in their world, being adaptable could save your life. And there was more, Elena continued, her voice growing smaller, as if she were sinking into the past. Daniel always drew one picture. Every single day he drew it. 2 children holding hands, and a tall man in a black suit standing behind them. Daniel said that was his real family. Daniel said that one day he would find them again. Marcus rose abruptly, walked to the window, and turned his back to Elena. He didn't want her to see his eyes turning red and wet. 32 years. His little brother still remembered, still believed, still waited. Elena hesitated for a moment, then added one more thing. Daniel remembered something else, too. He said his big brother always called him Champ, and he remembered a very beautiful woman who played the piano every night. Marcus spun around, his eyes wide. His mother. She played the piano every evening before the 2 boys went to sleep. It was the last memory he had of her before she died of illness just 1 year after Daniel disappeared. Just then, the door to the study opened. An older woman walked in carrying a tray of tea. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who had been with the Blackwood family for more than 20 years. She set the tray down on the table, but her hands were trembling so badly the teacups rattled softly against their saucers. "I heard all of it," Mrs. Chen said, her voice thick with emotion. "Young Master Daniel. I still remember the day he vanished. The former master, Marcus's father, he never stopped suffering. He searched until the day he closed his eyes for the last time." Mrs. Chen wiped away her tears, then turned to look at Elena. There was no suspicion in her gaze, no guarded caution, the way Elena so often received from others in this house. "You're a good person," Mrs. Chen said slowly. "I don't misjudge people. 20 years in this home, I've seen every kind of person there is. If you say young Master Daniel is alive, I believe you." Warmth spread through Elena's chest. For the first time since she came here, someone believed her immediately, without proof, without demanding more explanation. She looked at Mrs. Chen with grateful eyes. Marcus turned back, his voice rough. "Where is he? Where is Daniel now?" Elena lowered her head, sorrow plain on her face. "I don't know, sir. When Daniel was 16, he ran away from the orphanage. He said he couldn't wait any longer, that he had to go and find his brother himself. I begged him to stay, but he'd already made up his mind. That was the last time I ever saw him." Marcus stood there as if turned to stone. 32 years. His brother had lived for 32 years and he hadn't known. Daniel had grown up in an orphanage, had waited, had hoped, had run away to look for him, and all that time, Marcus had believed his brother was dead. He clenched his hands until his knuckles went white. When his voice finally came, it was barely more than a breath. 32 years. He was alive for 32 years. That evening, after Marcus left the study with a face full of thought, Mrs. Chen led Elena down to the kitchen for tea. The sprawling mansion sank into silence, broken only by the steady tick of the wall clock counting each second with patient regularity. Mrs. Chen poured Elena a cup, then sat across from her, a shadow of sadness passing through her eyes as she looked toward the staircase leading to the second floor. "Are you wondering about the boy, Ethan?" Mrs. Chen asked softly. Elena nodded. From her very first day here, she'd noticed the 7-year-old wasn't like other children. He never left his room, never spoke to anyone, only clutched an old, worn teddy bear, as if it were the one thing that kept him tethered to this world. Mrs. Chen sighed, then began to tell her story. 1 year ago, the master's wife, Isabella, was assassinated by the Castellano gang, the Blackwood family's greatest enemy. That day, Isabella was taking Ethan home from school. They stopped the car right in the middle of the street. Ethan was in the back seat, and the boy heard everything. The crack of gunfire, the shatter of glass, his mother's single cry, and then she collapsed forward onto the steering wheel. The boy saw blood. He saw that his mother didn't move anymore. Elena set her teacup down, her hands trembling slightly. She could picture the terror the child had been forced to endure. Mrs. Chen continued, her voice weighted with grief. From that day on, Ethan didn't speak a single word, not one word. He locked himself in his room, holding the teddy bear Isabella had given him before she died. The master brought in the best psychologists money could buy, spent a fortune, but no one could do anything. The boy was like an empty shell, there, and yet not there. Mrs. Chen fell silent for a moment, then added in a smaller voice, as if afraid someone might overhear. Isabella. She was complicated. There were many things she kept from the master. Elena lifted her gaze. Kept what? Mrs. Chen shook her head. It's not my place to say. But you should know, the master has reasons for finding it hard to trust anyone. He's been wounded very deeply, not only by losing his brother, but by the fact that the people he trusted most were the very ones who betrayed him in the most painful way. Elena didn't press further. She understood there were secrets you didn't touch until the time was right. Yet inside her, she felt a strange sympathy for that cold, guarded man. Mrs. Chen studied Elena, her look searching but gentle. You seem to understand other people's pain. You've been through something too, haven't you? Elena lowered her head as painful memories surged back like floodwater. She drew a breath, then spoke, her voice small and even, as if she were telling the story of someone else instead of her own life. When I was 9, my parents were killed in a robbery right in front of me. I hid in a closet, watching through the crack in the door. I saw everything. After that, I couldn't speak for 2 years. Not one word. Just like Ethan now. Mrs. Chen reached for Elena's hand, her eyes shining with tears. Then you understand the boy. You understand what it feels like. Elena nodded. That was why, When she looked at Ethan, she didn't see a bad child or a psychological case. She saw herself from 22 years ago. She rose, left the kitchen, and walked toward the staircase. When she passed through the second-floor hallway, she stopped at Ethan's door. It was cracked open just a sliver, and through that narrow opening, she saw the boy's eyes watching her. Big, round eyes, sad, but not frightened the way she'd expected. In those eyes there was curiosity. And there was something else too. Something that looked like hope. Elena didn't step closer. She simply stood there and offered a very small smile. A smile that demanded nothing, forced nothing. Just a quiet way of letting him know she was here. And she wasn't a threat. Ethan watched her for a long time. Then, instead of slamming the door shut the way he always did with everyone else, he stepped back once and left the door still partly open. Elena understood what that meant. A sign, a tiny sign, but one that mattered more than it seemed. He wasn't pushing her away. And for a child who had kept his heart locked behind a closed door for an entire year, that was already a very large step forward. The next day, Elena began carrying out a small plan she'd thought through all night. She didn't try to knock on Ethan's door or force the boy to talk. Instead, she took a small yellow slip of paper, wrote a few words on it, and gently slid it through the gap beneath his door. On the first note, she wrote that today the clouds looked like a little rabbit, and asked if he could see it too. She didn't wait for an answer. She simply left the note there and quietly walked away. On the third day, she left another note. This time she wrote that she'd noticed he liked the color blue, and she did too, blue like the ocean. On the fifth day, her note carried a different message. She wrote that he didn't have to speak, only to know that someone was here, someone who understood. On the seventh day, Elena spent the whole evening drawing a small cat on the yellow paper. She wrote that the cat's name was Whiskers, and that it was shy, just like us. She didn't know whether Ethan read those notes. She didn't know whether he cared. But every morning when she passed by his room, the yellow slips she'd left the day before were gone. Someone had picked them up. And Elena knew it wasn't Mrs. Chen or anyone else in the house. 1 week passed. Then 2. Elena kept patiently leaving the yellow notes every day. She wrote about the weather, about the flowers in the garden, about the bird that perched on the kitchen window every morning. Small, ordinary things, but full of warmth. Late one night, Marcus walked past his son's room after he'd finished dealing with work. He meant to head straight to his own room as usual, but the light spilling through the crack under Ethan's door made him stop. Normally, his son turned the light off early and curled up in the dark. He stepped closer, carefully, and looked through the slightly open door. And what he saw made him go still. Ethan was sitting on the bed, holding a yellow slip of paper with the drawing of a cat, and on the boy's lips was a smile. A small smile, light as a butterfly's wing, but it was a real smile. For the first time in 1 year, Marcus saw his son smile. He stood there a long time, not daring to move, afraid of breaking the moment. Tears rose, but he forced them back. That night, he couldn't sleep. The next morning, Marcus called Elena into the study. When the door closed behind her, Elena felt her heart pounding. She thought she'd done something wrong. Maybe she'd crossed the line for a maid. Maybe she was about to be dismissed. Marcus stood with his back to her, staring out the window. His voice was rough when he spoke. "What did you do to my son?" Elena swallowed, her voice trembling slightly. "I only left a few notes under his door, sir. Small notes with a few lines. I didn't force him to do anything." Marcus turned around, his expression hard to read. "Why? That isn't your job." Elena took a deep breath. "Because I know what that feels like. Feeling so afraid you can't speak. Feeling like no one in this world understands you. I've been in that darkness. And I know that sometimes what a child needs isn't doctors or medicine, but simply to know that someone is nearby, not judging, not demanding anything at all." Marcus was silent for a long time. Then he asked, his voice softening just a little, "Where did you learn this?" Elena lowered her eyes. "I always dreamed of becoming a teacher. I read a lot of books about child psychology, about how to help wounded children, but an orphan like me didn't have the chance to go to college." Marcus looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze wasn't cold or suspicious. In the eyes of that powerful man, there was something else, something close to respect. "Starting today," he said slowly, "your main job is to take care of Ethan. I'm going to triple your pay. If you need anything, tell Mrs. Chen." Elena's eyes widened, unable to believe what she'd just heard. She tried to say something, but Marcus had already turned back to the window, signaling the conversation was over. She bowed her head in thanks and left the room. Outside, Mrs. Chen was waiting. She looked at Elena with a warm smile. I told you. You're someone special. Immediately after his conversation with Elena, Marcus began to move. He wasn't the kind of man who sat and waited when there was something he could do. He called Tony, the best information technology specialist in the organization. He reached out to the private investigators he'd hired for his most critical cases. He activated the entire network spread across the United States, the people in the shadows he'd built up over 20 years. Find Daniel Blackwood, he ordered. Use every resource. I don't care how much money it costs or how long it takes. Find my brother. Elena was called in to provide more information. She sat in Marcus's study, trying to remember every smallest detail she knew about Daniel. He always dreamed of becoming an artist, Elena said. He drew beautifully, especially people. He loved the sea, always said he wanted to live somewhere he could see the ocean every day. And he hated being confined, hated rigid rules. Maybe that was why he couldn't stand life in the orphanage. Marcus wrote down every detail. Did he use another name? Elena thought for a moment. At the orphanage, the kids used to call him Danny, and sometimes he signed his drawings as Danny Black, taken from his Blackwood surname. The information went out everywhere. Hackers began digging through every database, from police records to hospital files, from rental lists to social media accounts. Private investigators combed through major cities, especially places with street artist communities. 3 days later, the first lead appeared. A man named Daniel Blackwood had once been arrested for painting graffiti on a wall in New York about 10 years earlier. The file showed he was fined and released. After that, the name Daniel Blackwood vanished completely from the system, as if that person no longer existed. But 1 week later, another rumor surfaced. An investigator on the West Coast reported that there was a fairly well-known street artist in San Francisco named Danny Black. He drew portraits for tourists at Fisherman's Wharf. There were no official records on him, no fixed address, no bank account. He lived like a ghost, but the face in the candid photographs made Marcus's heart feel as if it stopped. It was exactly like his. While waiting for final confirmation, Marcus often stood alone in his study at night, looking at the photograph of the twin boys on the mantel. He wondered whether Daniel still remembered him, whether his brother knew what he had become. Marcus had killed people. He had tortured enemies. He had built an empire on other people's blood and tears. He was a Mafia boss, a name that made people afraid. Would Daniel want to meet a brother like that? Or would his brother feel disgust when he learned the truth? One evening, Mrs. Chen entered the room when she saw Marcus still standing there in the dark. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle but certain. He's your own flesh and blood. Flesh and blood doesn't judge. Flesh and blood forgives. No matter who you are, no matter what you've done, he's still your brother, and you're still his brother. Don't let fear stop you from finding your family again. Marcus didn't speak, but he took Mrs. Chen's wrinkled hand and gave it a small squeeze, a silent thank you. Just then, the phone on the desk rang sharply. Marcus picked up, his heart beating faster. Tony's voice came through the line, excited. We found him, boss. Daniel Blackwood, 36 years old, street artist, currently living and working at Fisherman's Wharf, San Francisco. We confirmed his identity through facial matching. It's 100% him. Marcus stood there with the phone still pressed to his ear, but for a long moment he couldn't say anything at all. 32 years. 32 years of searching. 32 years of suffering. 32 years of believing his brother was dead. And now, at last, he had found him. He whispered, his voice thick and breaking. We found him. Marcus didn't tell anyone. He simply took his private jet and flew straight to San Francisco in the middle of the night. The entire flight, he couldn't sleep. He kept staring at the photograph of Daniel the investigators had sent him. That face, those lines. It was like looking into a mirror, 32 years apart, and yet they still matched down to the smallest detail. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Fisherman's Wharf just as the sun was coming up. The waterfront was already alive with tourists, street vendors, and artists. He walked along the path beside the sea, his heart pounding hard in his chest. Then he saw him. Daniel sat on a small wooden chair, an easel set in front of him. He was drawing a portrait for a young woman, his hand guiding the brush gently across the canvas. Marcus stopped about 10 steps away, not daring to come any closer. He only stood there and watched. They looked strangely the same, and yet they were completely different. Marcus in an expensive black suit, a Rolex flashing on his wrist, the cold, sharp gaze of a Mafia boss. Daniel in an old hoodie worn thin at the shoulders, hands stained with paint, a soft, warm smile as he talked with his customer. The same face, but two entirely different lives. When the young woman walked away with her portrait, Daniel lifted his head, and his eyes met Marcus's. The brush slipped from his fingers and rolled across the ground. Daniel jumped to his feet, eyes wide, lips moving, but no sound came out. The silence stretched, only the waves breaking against the rocks. The cry of gulls overhead, the laughter and chatter of tourists around them seemed to fall back, turning distant and blurred. Two grown men stood staring at each other, 32 years of separation compressed into a single moment. Then Daniel started walking toward him. One step, then another, until he stood right in front of Marcus. His mouth curved into a smile, but his eyes were wet and red. "You took a long time to find me, big brother." Marcus felt his throat lock tight. When his voice came, it was barely a breath. "You're alive. 32 years. You were alive for 32 years. They hugged in the middle of the crowded street. No one said anything else. Nothing else was needed. Two grown men held each other like the 4-year-old boys they once were, as if the last 32 years had never happened. After a while, they sat on a bench by the water. Daniel told Marcus his story. When he was 4, he was kidnapped by the Castellano gang, their father's enemy. They didn't kill him. They sold him to a childless couple in Detroit. That couple treated him well, but Daniel never forgot his real family. He remembered his brother, the big house, their father in a black suit, their mother playing the piano every night. When he was 9, his adoptive parents died in a car accident. He was sent to Street Michael's orphanage. He told people about his Mafia family, about his twin brother, but no one believed him. They thought he was making it up, thought something was wrong with him. When he was 16, he couldn't take it anymore. He ran away, deciding to find his brother on his own, but he was just a kid with no money, no family, no leads. He drifted, doing whatever work he could to survive, and he learned to draw from street artists he met along the way. He searched for Marcus, but he didn't know where to start, didn't know whether Marcus was still alive or already dead. "I never stopped believing you would find me," Daniel said, his voice trembling slightly. "Every night, I drew our picture, 2 little boys holding hands. I held on to that faith for 32 years. Marcus felt tears running down his cheeks. For the first time in 20 years, he cried. He wasn't a cold Mafia boss anymore. He was only a brother who had lost his brother for far too long. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have found you sooner." Daniel rested a hand on his shoulder, a gentle smile on his lips. "You found me now. That's what matters most." On the private flight back to Chicago, the 2 brothers sat side by side. Daniel looked out the window at the clouds below. Then he turned to Marcus, his voice gentle, but threaded with worry. "Elena, is she doing all right? Is she happy?" Marcus looked at his brother, a little surprised. Elena, the housemaid who had opened the door that led him to Daniel. He realized the bond between his brother and that young woman ran far deeper than he'd imagined. They weren't only orphanage friends. They had been family to each other through the hardest years. "She's all right," Marcus answered. "She's living in my house, and she's helping Ethan, my son, recover from a very severe psychological trauma." Daniel smiled, his eyes brightening. "I always knew she'd do wonderful things. She has the warmest heart I've ever known." Marcus didn't speak, but inside him a thought began to take shape. That girl wasn't just a maid. She was the one who had given him back his brother, the one who was healing his son. She was far more extraordinary than he'd ever allowed himself to believe. When Marcus and Daniel stepped into the mansion, Elena was wiping down a table in the living room. She heard footsteps and looked up. The cloth slipped from her hand. She stood there as if turned to stone, one hand flying to cover her mouth, eyes wide, unable to believe what she was seeing. "Danny," she whispered, her voice trembling. The man beside Marcus smiled, that gentle smile she had never forgotten, even after 20 years had passed. "Hello, little sister," Daniel said, his voice warm. Elena ran to him and threw her arms around him, sobbing. 20 years. 20 years of thinking she'd lost him forever. 20 years of praying every night that he was safe somewhere out there. And now he was here, in her arms. Daniel held her tightly, stroking her hair the way he used to when they were still at the orphanage. "I'm sorry I didn't come back for you," he whispered. "I promised I would." Elena shook her head, tears still falling. "It's all right. You found your family. That's enough." A small sound from the staircase made everyone turn. Ethan was hiding behind his bedroom door, his big eyes fixed on the unfamiliar man with a mix of curiosity and caution. Daniel gently let go of Elena and crouched until he was level with the boy's gaze. He pulled a small paintbrush and a sheet of paper from his pocket. "I heard you like drawing," Daniel said softly. "I do too. Do you want to see what I can draw?" Ethan didn't answer, but he didn't run away either. Daniel began to draw on the paper, his strokes quick and steady. In just a few minutes, a majestic dragon appeared. Wings spread wide as if it were rising into the sky. Ethan's eyes widened, and for the first time in a long while, the boy stepped out of hiding on his own. He walked over to Daniel, staring at the drawing with open admiration. Daniel held the paintbrush out to him. "Your turn." Ethan hesitated, then took the brush. He scribbled in the corner of the paper, clumsy lines drawn by a 7-year-old hand. But when he finished, he looked up at Daniel and spoke, his voice small and rough from being unused for so long. "Uncle Danny." The whole room seemed to stop breathing. Elena lifted a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over again. Mrs. Chen stood in the kitchen doorway, crying soundlessly. Marcus stood in the corner of the room, tears sliding down the cheeks of a man who hadn't cried in front of anyone for 20 years. He had to turn away because he didn't want anyone to see him like this. "Mrs. Chen stepped forward and put her arms around Elena. "You brought this family back to life," she whispered. The days that followed were the happiest days the Blackwood mansion had ever known. Laughter rang through rooms that had once been drowned in silence. Marcus began coming home earlier, no longer staying at the office until deep into the night the way he used to. One evening, the whole family sat down together around the large dining table in the dining room. Marcus, Daniel, Elena, and Ethan. Elena cooked a simple meal. Nothing fancy, but warm in the way comfort is warm. Everyone praised it. Everyone smiled. Ethan sat pressed close to Elena through the entire meal, refusing to leave her side for even a step. That night, Marcus passed Ethan's room and stopped at the door. Elena was sitting beside his son's bed, singing a soft lullaby. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it was full of love. Ethan was sleeping deeply, his face peaceful, as if he'd never had a nightmare in his life. Marcus stood there a long time, his chest tightening with a feeling he couldn't name. He hadn't felt anything like it since Isabella was alive. No. This was stronger than that, deeper than that, truer than that. While the whole family was enjoying a warm dinner inside, a figure stood utterly still in the darkness outside the mansion. Victor Kane, 40 years old, Marcus's right hand for 15 years. He stood by the fence, his gaze cutting through the glass into the brightly lit dining room. He saw Marcus laughing, a smile he hadn't seen on his boss's face in many years. He saw Daniel, the lost younger brother, now sitting beside Marcus, as if those 32 years of separation had never existed. He saw Elena, the nameless maid, seated beside Ethan, the boy now smiling and talking like an ordinary child. And Victor felt anger boil and surge inside his chest. 15 years he had built this empire alongside Marcus. 15 years of cleaning up bodies, laundering money, negotiating with enemies, doing the dirtiest work so Marcus could keep his hands clean. 15 years of absolute loyalty, without a single complaint, without a single act of betrayal. And what did he get? A generous salary, yes. Respect inside the organization, yes. But he was never treated like family. Then one fine day, a lost brother appeared and was instantly treated like a prince. A nameless maid walked in and made Marcus Blackwood, the coldest mafia boss in Chicago, turn soft like this. Marcus was losing focus. He was spending too much time on family, too little time on business. The empire was starting to sway, and he didn't even see it. And Victor wasn't going to let everything he had built collapse because of a maid and a drifting painter. Victor turned his back and stepped into the shadows. He remembered the night before, sitting in the underground casino on the south side, watching the pile of chips in front of him grow thinner and thinner. He'd lost badly. $2 million owed to the Castellano gang, Marcus's sworn enemy. He didn't have the money to pay, and the Castellano crew weren't the kind of people who waited patiently. He needed money, a lot of money. Or he needed something to pay with, something more valuable than money. Victor stopped at the corner of the garden, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number he had saved but had never dared to call, not until today. After a few rings, a cold voice came through the line. "Victor, I didn't expect you to call." Victor drew a deep breath. Blackwood is getting soft. There's a maid. She's his weakness. Silence for a moment. Then the voice replied, "Then remove her." Victor smiled, a smile cold as ice. "I've already got a plan. Give me 1 week." He ended the call and looked back toward the window. Elena was smiling at Ethan, clearing the table, completely unaware that darkness was crouched just beyond the glass. Victor watched her, his eyes hard as stone. "Enjoy it, little maid. Enjoy it while you can." 1 week later, Victor's plan began. Early that morning, Mrs. Chen went into the master bedroom to tidy up as usual. She stopped short when she saw Isabella's jewelry cabinet standing open. She remembered clearly that she had locked it the day before. Her heart started to race as she stepped closer to check. And when she looked inside, The blood in her veins seemed to turn to ice. The diamond necklace was gone. It was the most precious keepsake Isabella had left behind, the piece Marcus had given his wife on their wedding day. After Isabella died, Marcus had placed it in the cabinet and never opened it again. It was the one thing he kept to remember her by. Mrs. Chen ran to find Marcus at once. She told him what she'd seen, her voice shaking with worry. Marcus shot to his feet, his face draining pale. He called Victor in and ordered him to find the necklace at any cost. Victor nodded, his expression grave and concerned. The picture of a loyal subordinate. He asked permission to search the rooms of every staff member in the house, to rule out the possibility of internal theft. Marcus agreed. Half an hour later, Victor returned to Marcus's study. In his hand was the diamond necklace, glittering. His face looked pained, as if he had just been forced to do something difficult. "Where did you find it?" Marcus asked, his voice cold as ice. Victor lowered his head, pretending he couldn't bear to meet his boss's eyes. "In Elena's room, sir, under her pillow. I'm sorry. I didn't want to believe it either, but the evidence was too clear." Marcus said nothing. He took the necklace and stared at it for a long time. Then he ordered Victor to bring Elena to the study. Elena walked in with a worried expression. She sensed the tension the moment the door opened. Marcus stood with his back to her, looking out the window. Victor stood in the corner, stern and watchful. "You called for me?" Elena asked quietly. Marcus didn't turn around. He only set the necklace on the desk, the sound of diamonds touching wood ringing out in the silence. Elena looked at the necklace and her face went pale. "What is this?" Marcus turned, his eyes colder than she had ever seen, as if he had never once looked at her with warmth at all. "You tell me. I've never seen this before," Elena said, her voice beginning to tremble. "I didn't take it. It was found in your room," Marcus said slowly. "Under your pillow." Elena shook her head as tears began to spill. "No, someone put it there. Someone is setting me up." Marcus gave a short, humorless laugh, a sound without a trace of warmth. "Who?" "Victor has worked for me for 15 years. You've been here for 2 months. I don't know who," Elena cried. "But I swear on my parents' grave, I didn't take that necklace. Please, sir, believe me." The silence stretched. The room seemed to stop breathing. Then Elena asked, her voice only a desperate whisper, "Do you believe me?" Marcus didn't answer. He looked away, his jaw tightening. That silence hurt more than any words could have. Elena understood. He didn't believe her. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't beg anymore. Just then, Mrs. Chen rushed into the room, breathless. She had heard what was happening. "Marcus, don't decide so quickly," she said fast. "I know this girl. She's not that kind of person. Investigate more before you decide." Marcus cut her off, his voice cold and final. "Enough. I've decided." He turned to Elena, and there wasn't a shred of feeling left in his eyes. "Get out of my house. Don't ever come back." Elena stood there for a moment, looking at the man she had begun to trust, the man she thought was different from the others. Then she wiped her tears and lifted her chin. "I thought you were different," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I was wrong." She turned and walked out. "Mrs. Chen cried, calling her name. But Elena didn't turn back. She went straight to her room, packed the few belongings she had, and left the Blackwood mansion without looking back even once. Victor stood in the corner, his face showing nothing, but inside he was smiling to himself. The plan had worked perfectly. Marcus stood alone in the study after everyone had gone. He gripped the necklace so tightly in his hand his knuckles turned white. He'd done the right thing. He had to protect himself and his son. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. But why did his chest hurt like this? Why did it feel as if he had just lost something important? That night, the sky opened up and the rain came down in sheets. Elena carried a small bag with a few changes of clothes and the child psychology book she'd kept with her since the orphanage, and she walked out through the gates of the Blackwood estate. She didn't look back. She didn't cry anymore. She only kept walking through the rain, letting the icy water mingle with the ache inside her chest. The sound of hurried footsteps chasing after her made her stop. Mrs. Chen ran up, holding an umbrella and an envelope. She pressed the envelope into Elena's hand, breathing hard from running. "There's some money in here," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I believe you. I know you didn't do it. Don't give up. Find a way to prove you're innocent." Elena looked at the older woman who had treated her like a daughter from the very first day she arrived here. She wanted to say something, but her throat had locked shut. All she could do was nod, then turn and walk away, leaving Mrs. Chen standing in the rain, watching her disappear behind the curtain of water. The next morning, Ethan woke up and ran downstairs like he did every day, searching for Elena. He'd grown used to her being there each morning, used to her smile, to the yellow notes she slid under his door. But today, she was nowhere. He ran through the house, checking room after room, calling her name in the soft voice he had only just found again after a year of silence. Mrs. Chen had to sit down, take his hand, and tell him the truth. Elena is gone, sweetheart. She isn't here anymore. Ethan went still. His eyes widened, full of confusion. Then, as if someone had switched off the light inside him, the brightness in Ethan's gaze went out. He turned, ran up the stairs, went into his room, and slammed the door. After that, he didn't speak another word. All the progress Elena had helped him make over the past weeks dissolved in a single night. He became an empty shell again, curled up on the bed, clutching his mother's teddy bear and the yellow slips of paper Elena had written for him. When Daniel heard, he stormed straight into Marcus's study without knocking. His face was flushed with anger, his hands clenched into fists. "What did you do?" Daniel shouted. "She's innocent." Marcus sat behind his desk, his face cold as stone. "You don't know that." Daniel stepped closer and slammed his palm on the desk. "I know her. I grew up with her. She would never steal anything." Marcus stood, facing his brother. "People change. People lie. I learned that the hard way." Daniel stared at him, his eyes full of disappointment and pain. "This is about Isabella, isn't it?" Marcus froze. His silence was the answer. Daniel moved closer, his voice softening a little. "Tell me, what happened?" Marcus turned his back, staring out the window. A long time passed before he spoke, his voice sounding like every word was a blade carving into his heart. "Isabella. 3 months before she died, I found out she was feeding information to the Castellano family, our biggest enemy." Daniel stood motionless, shocked. Marcus continued, bitterness in his voice. "She was a spy. Our entire marriage was a lie. I confronted her. She begged for forgiveness. I didn't know what to do." He drew in a deep breath, pain etched into every line of his face. "Then they killed her. The Castellano gang. She wasn't useful to them anymore, so they got rid of her. I couldn't save her. I couldn't trust her. And now, I can't trust anyone anymore." Silence covered the room. Daniel stood there, taking in what his brother had just said. Then he spoke, his voice sorrowful but firm. "So you're punishing Elena for Isabella's sins?" Marcus turned back. "I'm protecting myself. Protecting Ethan." "No," Daniel shook his head. "You're destroying the only good thing that has happened to this family. Elena isn't Isabella. She's the one who brought me back to you. She's the one who saved your son, and you threw her out because you're too afraid to trust again." Marcus said nothing. He couldn't, because deep down he knew his brother was right. But he'd gone too far. He didn't know how to turn back. Daniel walked toward the door. Before he left, he stopped and spoke without turning around. "I'm going to prove she's innocent. And when I do, you'd better be ready to beg for forgiveness." The door closed. Marcus stood alone in the empty room, looking down at the diamond necklace, still lying on the desk. He had been right to send Elena away. He had to be right, because if he was wrong, he hadn't only lost her, he had lost himself. Elena sat in a shabby apartment in an unsafe neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. The room was tiny, the walls blotched with damp. The old bed creaked every time she shifted, and the window wouldn't seal, so cold air kept slipping in all night long. The money Mrs. Chen had given her was nearly gone. She couldn't find work because she had no reference, no stable address, and no one was willing to trust a young woman who'd just been fired for stealing. She sat by the window, watching the rain fall outside, her arms wrapped around the educational psychology book she'd carried with her from the orphanage. That book was her dream, her hope that one day she would become a teacher and help wounded children the way she once needed to be helped. But now, that dream felt farther away than it had ever been. Tears fell onto the pages, blurring the words. She thought back to the night 20 years ago, the night Daniel ran away from the orphanage. She'd been 11 then, and Daniel had been 16. They stood behind the orphanage, beneath a faint moon, and Daniel held her hand and said he was going to find his brother, and then he would come back for her. He promised. Little Elena had asked, her voice trembling, "What if you can't find him?" Daniel smiled, that warm smile she had never been able to forget. "I will find him, and we'll be a family. You, me, and my brother. I promise you that." 20 years had passed. That promise still hadn't come true. And now, when they had finally found each other, when the family Daniel had promised had almost become real, everything had collapsed in a single night. At the same time, In the Blackwood mansion, Marcus sat alone in his pitch-dark study. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't drink. He only sat there, staring into nothing, letting the darkness swallow him whole. Ethan hadn't left his room since the day Elena walked out. The boy had fallen back into silence, curled up on his bed with his teddy bear and the old yellow notes. Mrs. Chen set food outside his door, but the plate was still untouched when she returned. The mansion was silent as a grave, exactly as it had been before Elena ever arrived. Marcus lifted the diamond necklace and stared at it in the moonlight slipping through the window. Then he looked at the photograph of the twin boys on the mantel. He had done the right thing. He had to have done the right thing. But why did the question keep rising in him? Was I wrong? Elena's phone vibrated, pulling her out of the dark drift of her thoughts. She looked at the screen and saw Daniel's name. She hesitated, then answered. Daniel's voice came through the line, steady with determination. I'm going to find the truth. Don't give up. Our promise is still alive. Daniel didn't have money to hire private investigators, but he had something else, his connections to people inside the Blackwood mansion. He went to Mrs. Chen and asked for her help. Mrs. Chen didn't hesitate. She had believed Elena from the beginning, and she would do anything to prove that young woman was innocent. She contacted Tony, the information technology specialist who had worked for Marcus for more than 10 years. Tony was loyal to the Blackwood family, and more importantly, he didn't believe Elena was a thief either. Something isn't right about this, Tony said when he met Daniel in a small cafe in the suburbs. I'll check the house security cameras. If someone set her up, the cameras will have recorded it. It took Tony 2 days to hack into the mansion's security camera system without Victor or anyone else noticing. And what he found shocked both Daniel and Mrs. Chen. Footage from the second-floor hallway camera clearly showed that at 3 o'clock in the morning, the night before the necklace was found, Victor Kane had slipped into Elena's room. He was holding something in his hand, went straight to her bed, and hid it under her pillow. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes. He left the room with a cold expression, without a flicker of hesitation. Daniel's hands tightened into fists as he watched the video. That man, he framed her. But Tony didn't stop there. He dug deeper, hacking into Victor's phone remotely. And what he uncovered was far more serious. Victor had a massive gambling debt, $2 million, owed to the Castellano gang. He had lost everything in underground casinos and had no way to pay it back. But what made Daniel's blood boil were the messages Victor had sent to someone in the Castellano gang. Blackwood is losing focus. His empire is weakening. Hand control over to me, and I'll pay everything off. Daniel read those lines again and again, rage surging inside him. Victor hadn't only framed Elena. He was betraying Marcus, selling out the entire empire he had helped build over 15 years. That very afternoon, Daniel stormed into Marcus's study. He set a laptop on the desk and opened the security video without saying a word. Marcus looked at his brother with irritation, but he turned to the screen, and what he saw made him spring to his feet. The video showed Victor sneaking into Elena's room at 3 o'clock in the morning, hiding something under her pillow. Marcus's face shifted from doubt to shock, then from shock to fury. A fury that was cold, terrifying, and far worse than any outburst Daniel had ever seen. "Victor," Marcus roared, his voice like the growl of a wounded beast. Daniel pulled up the messages Tony had found. "He framed her," Daniel said. "He used her to destroy you from the inside. He owes the Castellano gang $2 million and he's selling you out to pay his debt." Marcus read the messages, each word like a knife driven into his back. 15 years. Victor had worked for him for 15 years. Marcus had trusted him the way he trusted his own hands. And Victor betrayed him. Marcus had thrown an innocent woman out of his home, while the true enemy stood beside him the whole time. Marcus didn't say another word. He walked to the desk, opened the drawer, and took out a gun. He checked the magazine, then looked at Daniel, his eyes ice cold and burning with rage. "Call everyone. Right now." Marcus called Victor and told him to come to an old warehouse on the south side to discuss something important. His voice was as normal as it always was, without a trace of suspicion or anger. Victor had no idea it was a trap. He arrived at 9 o'clock that night, walking in with the confident air of a loyal right hand. The warehouse was vast and dark, with only a single light burning in the middle. Marcus sat there with his back to the door, a battered wooden table in front of him. "You sent for me, boss?" Victor asked as he stepped inside, his voice still coated in false respect. Marcus didn't turn around. "How long has it been, Victor?" Victor stopped, slightly confused. "How long since what, sir?" Marcus stood, turned to face him, set a laptop on the table, and played the video. "How long have you been betraying me?" Victor's face went pale as he watched himself on the screen. slipping into Elena's room at 3 o'clock in the morning, hiding the necklace under her pillow. He watched the messages he had sent to the Castellano gang appear line by line. "I can explain," Victor stammered, taking a step back. Marcus moved toward him, each footfall like the beat of a war drum. "You framed an innocent woman. You tried to tear my family apart. For 15 years, I trusted you like a brother. And you betrayed me over a gambling debt." Victor saw there was no way out. In a flash, he bent down and pulled a small gun from where it was strapped at his ankle. The motion was lightning fast. He aimed the gun straight at Marcus. "You've gotten soft, Marcus." Victor snarled, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "That Maid, that long-lost brother, they've made you weak. I built this empire with you. 15 years I cleaned up your filth. I deserve more than being your dog." He tightened his grip, finger on the trigger. Maybe it's time to change leadership. A gunshot exploded from behind Victor. He dropped to the floor, the bullet tearing into his shoulder. His gun flew from his hand and skidded across the concrete. Daniel stepped out of the shadows in the corner of the warehouse, the gun in his hand still smoking. "You forgot about me, Victor," Daniel said coldly. At once, Marcus's men appeared from everywhere, surrounding Victor. He lay on the floor, blood streaming from his shoulder, but he was still laughing, a laugh that was pained and crazed. Marcus walked up and stood over him, looking down at the man who had once been his right hand with eyes as cold as ice. "You want my empire? You'll get nothing." Victor spat blood, still laughing. "It doesn't matter. The Castellano gang will come for you. With me or without me, they're coming." Marcus crouched, staring straight into his eyes. "Let them come. But you won't be here to watch it." He signaled his men. "Take him away." 2 large men hauled Victor up and dragged him out of the warehouse. His fate would be decided by the law of the jungle, the very law he had helped Marcus enforce for 15 years. Now he would taste it in his own flesh. The warehouse fell silent again. Only Marcus and Daniel remained beneath the dim yellow light. Marcus looked down at the pool of blood on the floor where Victor had been lying. He drew a deep breath, then spoke, his voice heavy. "I made a terrible mistake." Daniel stepped closer and put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Then fix it. She's waiting." Marcus drove through the curtain of night rain, heading toward the south side of Chicago. He had never been in this part of the city before. The streets were dark. The streetlights flickered. Trash lay scattered along the sidewalks, and shouting echoed from somewhere deep in the alleys. This was where Elena had been forced to live these past days because of him. An innocent girl pushed out of a warm home, framed by a traitor, and turned away by the very person she had trusted. His heart tightened with pain at the thought. He stopped in front of an old apartment building, its walls stained and its iron stairwell rusted through. He climbed the steps one by one, the rain still falling hard, soaking his expensive suit, but he didn't care. He stopped at the door of the apartment Tony had found. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. "Elena, it's me." Elena's voice came from inside, cold and distant. "Go away." Marcus pressed his hand to the door, his voice pleading. "Please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," Elena replied, her voice trembling slightly as if she were holding back everything she felt. "You didn't believe me. That's all I needed to know." Marcus stood there a moment, his forehead resting against the cold wood. Then he slowly sat down, his back against the wall beside the door. He didn't have the strength to stand anymore. He spoke through the narrow gap, his voice shaking and full of pain. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. And I'm afraid. Elena, I'm afraid of trusting someone and being betrayed again." He drew a deep breath and closed his eyes. "Isabella, my wife, 3 months before she died, I found out she was a spy. She fed information to my enemies for years. Our entire marriage was a lie, silence from inside. But Marcus knew Elena was listening. He went on, "I thought that if I never trusted anyone again, I'd never be hurt again. I built a wall around myself, around my son, and I didn't let anyone in. Then you came." His voice caught. "You found my brother after 32 years. You saved my son with those small yellow notes. You made me want to live, not just exist. And when Victor framed you, I didn't have the courage to believe. I chose safety instead of choosing you. That was the biggest mistake of my life." He stopped, tears running down his cheeks. "But you aren't, Isabella. You're Elena. You're the most extraordinary person I've ever met. And I pushed you away because I was too cowardly to open my heart again." The silence stretched. Marcus sat there in the damp darkness of the hallway, waiting. Then he heard the lock turn. The door opened slowly. Elena stood there, her face thinner now, her eyes swollen from crying too much, and yet she was still beautiful. Beautiful in a way no one else could ever be. Marcus was still on the floor. He looked up at her. "You hurt me, Marcus," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Worse than anyone has ever hurt me. I trusted you. I started to think maybe I'd found a family. And you shattered it all in one night." Marcus nodded, taking every word. "I know," he whispered, "and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, if you'll let me." Elena looked at him for a long time. Then she shook her head. "I'm not ready to forgive you." Marcus's heart felt like it was being crushed. He lowered his gaze, unable to look into her eyes. "I understand. I deserve that." But then Elena continued, her voice softening just a little. "But Mrs. Chen told me Ethan stopped speaking again. He hasn't left his room since the day I left." Marcus looked up, hope flooding his face. "I'll come back," Elena said slowly. "For Ethan, not for you. Not yet." She stepped past him where he sat. Without looking back, she went down the stairs, walked out into the night rain, toward Marcus's car. Marcus stayed there a moment longer, watching her disappear. Then he stood, wiping rain and tears from his face. She had given him a chance. Just one chance, small and fragile as a thread, and he knew what he had to do. He couldn't only speak, he had to prove it with action. He had to show her he was worthy of her trust, worthy of her love. No matter how long it took, he would. When Elena stepped into the Blackwood mansion the next morning, small footsteps sounded on the stairs. Ethan came rushing down like a whirlwind, throwing himself straight into her arms. He clung to her tightly, sobbing, his voice stumbling from emotion. "Don't go again. Don't ever go again." Elena dropped to her knees and gathered him against her, her own tears falling too. "Never," she whispered. "I promise." Mrs. Chen stood in the corner of the kitchen, wiping her eyes with her apron. She watched the scene with joy breaking open inside her. The girl had come back. This family could finally be stitched together again. Marcus stood in the doorway of his study, watching Elena and Ethan from a distance. He didn't walk over. He didn't say a word. He understood she needed time and space. He wouldn't force her, wouldn't demand anything. He would prove it through actions, not words. The very next day, Marcus summoned the entire organization. In front of hundreds of men, he announced Victor Kane's betrayal and declared Elena Torres completely innocent. "She was framed by a traitor," Marcus said, his voice echoing through the large room. "Anyone who dares lay a hand on her will answer to me." The news spread across Chicago. Everyone knew Elena was under Marcus Blackwood's protection. 1 week later, Elena returned to her room and found an envelope on the table. She opened it and went still. It was an acceptance letter to the University of Chicago, in the field of education. The tuition had been paid in full for 4 years. There was no note, no explanation. But she knew who it was from. She looked out the window and saw Marcus in the garden with Ethan. He didn't look up, as if he didn't want her to feel pressured to thank him. From then on, Marcus began asking Elena's opinion on everything related to Ethan. What the boy should eat, what he should learn, what he should play. He treated her like a member of the family, not a maid. He respected her, listened to her, but never crossed the boundary she had set. The days that followed passed in peace. In the afternoons, Daniel often sat in the garden teaching Ethan to draw. The boy learned eagerly from his talented uncle, his laughter ringing through the green, sun-cooled yard. Elena sat in a nearby chair, reading education books, preparing for college that was soon to begin. One afternoon, Marcus brought out drinks for everyone. He handed a glass to Daniel, to Ethan, then set one beside Elena. He sat down next to her and said nothing. They simply sat there, shoulders nearly touching, watching Ethan laugh and play with Daniel. No words were needed. Their presence beside each other was enough. One night, Ethan's screams echoed through the mansion. He was having a nightmare, calling his mother's name in panic. Marcus and Elena ran to his room at the same time. They sat on either side of the bed, each of them holding one of Ethan's hands. Slowly, the boy calmed, his breathing evening out, and he slipped into peaceful sleep. When Ethan was sleeping soundly, Marcus and Elena looked at each other in the dim light. There was a quiet moment, heavy with meaning. Marcus slowly reached out and took Elena's hand. "Thank you for coming back," he whispered. Elena looked at him, and for the first time since she returned, she smiled at him. A small smile, but sincere. "Thank you for giving me a reason to come back." A few days later, they stood in the garden beneath the moonlight. Elena was watching the night-blooming flowers when Marcus stepped up beside her. They stood in silence for a long time. Then Marcus turned to her, his eyes full of love and patient hope. Elena looked back, and when their lips met, It was a kiss as light as a butterfly's wing, like a promise that didn't need to be spoken. When they pulled apart, Elena looked at him and spoke softly. "I'm not saying I've completely forgiven you." Marcus nodded, smiling. "I know, and I'll wait as long as it takes." From the second-floor window, Daniel and Ethan were looking down into the garden. Ethan's eyes went wide, and he pointed. "Dad is kissing Miss Elena." Daniel laughed and ruffled his nephew's hair. "About time. He's so slow." 6 months slipped by like a dream. Elena began college, and her grades were excellent. She was the most diligent student in her class, always sitting in the front row, always finishing her assignments ahead of schedule. The professors were all impressed by the young woman with eyes full of determination and a hunger to learn. Ethan was now a completely different boy, healthy, joyful, chattier than ever. He no longer had nightmares, no longer clutched that old teddy bear as if he might lose it. He ran through the mansion from room to room, his laughter spilling into every corner. Daniel had moved into the estate for good and had begun working alongside Marcus. Together they were gradually legalizing their business operations, shifting from the underworld into clean enterprises. Daniel oversaw the arts and philanthropy side, using his gift for drawing to raise funds for orphan children. The Blackwood mansion was now filled with laughter and warmth, a world away from the cold house Elena had walked into nearly a year earlier. One evening, Marcus suddenly announced that the whole family would be going out to dinner at an upscale restaurant in downtown Chicago. Elena wondered as she settled into the car. "Is there some special occasion?" Marcus only smiled, mysterious. "You'll see." They arrived at a famous Italian restaurant and were led into a luxurious private room, candlelight flickering and fresh flowers arranged everywhere. The table was set for only 4: Marcus, Elena, Daniel, and Ethan. They ordered, they talked, they laughed, like any other family dinner. But Elena noticed Daniel and Marcus kept glancing at each other, as if they were holding on to some secret. In the middle of the meal, Daniel suddenly stood. "Ethan, come with Uncle and take a look at the kitchen." The boy looked up, tomato sauce on his lips. "But I want dessert." Daniel winked at his nephew. "Trust me, kid." Ethan got up reluctantly and followed Daniel out. But before he left, he turned back and flashed Elena a mischievous smile, as if he knew something she didn't. The room fell quiet. Only Marcus and Elena remained, sitting across from each other beneath the candlelight. Marcus drew a deep breath, then reached under the table and brought out a small box. Not a typical ring box, but a tiny pastry box. He set it in front of Elena. "Open it." Elena was startled, but she did. She lifted the lid, and her heart seemed to stop. Inside, nestled on the pastry, was a diamond ring, not too large, not too ornate, but beautiful in a refined, elegant way, exactly her style. When she looked up, Marcus was already down on one knee beside her. His eyes held nothing but love and sincerity. "You came into my house as a maid," he began, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "But you became Ethan's mother, Daniel's sister, and my whole world." He took her hand. "I don't deserve you. I know that. I've made mistakes. I've hurt you. But I still want to ask. Marry me. Not because I'm your employer, not because of what I can give you, but because I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." Tears ran down Elena's cheeks. She looked at the man kneeling before her, the man who had once been cold and distant, now opening himself to her completely. She nodded, her voice thick with tears. "I say yes." Marcus smiled, the brightest smile she had ever seen on his face. He took the ring, slid it gently onto her finger, then rose and kissed her there in the middle of the restaurant. At that moment, the door flew open. Daniel and Ethan ran in, with Mrs. Chen right behind them. Ethan shouted, bursting with excitement. She said yes. Mrs. Chen stood in the corner, crying like rain. At last, this family is finally whole. The 4 of them wrapped their arms around each other in a circle, laughing and crying at the same time. Elena looked around, at Daniel, at Ethan, at Marcus, at Mrs. Chen, and she realized this was the family she had dreamed of her whole life. A family doesn't need to share blood, it only needs to share a heart. 3 months after the engagement, the wedding was held right in the garden of the Blackwood estate. It wasn't a lavish ceremony with hundreds of guests, the kind people would expect from a Mafia boss. It was a warm, simple celebration, with only the most beloved people. The garden was dressed in white flowers and small lanterns, glowing like a dream beneath the sunset. Elena stepped forward in a plain white wedding dress. No elaborate beading, no sweeping train. Her hair fell naturally, with only a small flower tucked behind her ear. She was beautiful in her own way. Beautiful because sincerity and ease shone out of her eyes. Ethan was the ring-bearer, walking confidently along a carpet of flowers with a radiant smile. He had changed completely from the silent, frightened child of a year ago. Daniel stood beside Marcus as best man, wearing a suit for the first time in his life. And yet there were still a few smears of paint on his hands that he'd forgotten to wipe away. Father Thomas, the priest who had cared for Street, Michael's orphanage, where Elena and Daniel grew up, flew in from Detroit to officiate. He wept when he saw that the 2 orphan children from long ago had finally found their family. When it was time for vows, Marcus held Elena's hand and looked straight into her eyes, telling her that she had taught him trust wasn't weakness, that love wasn't losing control, that she had saved him in every way a person can be saved. Elena smiled through her tears and told him he had given her the family she'd dreamed of her whole life, not because of money, but because of love, real love. They kissed beneath an arch of white flowers, under the warm gold of late afternoon and the applause of those who loved them. And in that exact moment, Ethan ran up, threw his arms around Elena, and called out loudly, calling her Mom. Elena went still. It was the first time he had ever called her that. Tears spilled from her without restraint. She knelt and held him tight, sobbing with happiness. Daniel stepped in and hugged Marcus, his voice thick as he told him their father would be so proud of him. That night, after all the guests had gone, the 4 of them sat in the garden under a sky filled with stars. Marcus, Elena, Daniel, and Ethan. The boy slept deeply in Elena's arms, his face peaceful as an angel. Daniel looked up at the heavens and smiled, saying who would have imagined it, that 2 orphans and a mafia boss could become a family. Marcus pulled Elena close and said it was the best family. Elena lifted her eyes to the glittering stars, her voice light as breath, and asked if he thought they were watching them, his parents, her parents. Marcus kissed her forehead and said he was sure they were, and that they were smiling. Up there, if souls can look down, they were surely smiling, because the lost children had finally found home, because love, even if it came late, still came, because family isn't blood but the heart. And this family had more heart than any other. This story brings us precious lessons about life. First is the lesson of trust. Marcus lost too much because he didn't dare to trust. But in the end, he learned that trust isn't weakness, it's strength. Second is the lesson of patience and forgiveness. Elena didn't forgive immediately. She gave Marcus time to prove himself through action, and that is real forgiveness. Third is the lesson of family. Family doesn't have to be people who share blood. Family is the people who love one another, protect one another, and are willing to sacrifice for one another. And finally, the lesson of hope. No matter how hard life gets, no matter how many times you're pushed into the abyss, as long as you don't give up, happiness will come. Dear friends, how did this story make you feel? Was Marcus too slow to trust Elena? Did Victor receive the punishment he deserved? Did this story remind you of something in your own real life? We truly want to hear what you feel from the deepest place in your heart. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share this video with those who need to believe in second chances in life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss moving stories every day. We sincerely thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the end. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Always remember that no matter how difficult life becomes, love and family will always be the place we come back to. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.